Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. Dave is gone this week, and so we have a special guest, Loren Collingwood. He was raised locally in Arcata, went to Arcata High, transferred to Santa Rosa High to play soccer, then later graduated from CSU Chico in psychology, received a PhD from the University of Washington in political science, taught at UC Riverside for 7 years, and now is associate professor of political science at the University of New Mexico. And he is the CEO and founder of Collingwood Research, was the featured speaker of the 16th annual Victor Schaub Memorial Lecture on Local Politics at HSU in 2020. He's been a guest on various TV and radio shows, and he is gracing our show this time. And we are going to talk a bit about, well, what we've talked about on this show often, the redistricting, the gerrymandering, the gutting, the Voting Rights Act and what's left of it. And I think most of it, the redistricting is pretty much settled as we're sliding into the midterms. I think that it's pretty much we will determine who has the advantage in what states and overall as to whether or not the Republicans or Democrats gained an advantage. I actually expected the Republicans to actually have gained a bigger advantage from this because they control so many more states. But I sort of had predicted earlier on, as I started to take a look at it, they gerrymandered the last round so much that they really couldn't gerrymander. You can only squeeze so much out of it, and they gerrymandered so much that they couldn't anymore. Like Alabama, you can't. They had already crammed the black vote into one district. You can't do that anymore. Louisiana, the same thing. Texas, they couldn't really get any more, so they just basically consolidated so that their incumbents wouldn't be in trouble. Meanwhile, Democrats finally started doing their own gerrymandering. In Illinois, they finally did it, and there are no laws there against gerrymandering, so they got away with it there. Maryland, they tried to do it. Well, they actually had done it last time around, and they tried to do it a little bit more. Their court said you're going a little bit too far, so they had to back off it. I think they have one less fixed district. They tried to do it in New York, but again, their Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But it's still pretty much in their favor. But I think I think when it comes down to it, they're like 16 or 17 gerrymandered Republican states as opposed to 2 or 3 Democratic states. California, of course, is given to a neutral commission. Some people would argue it's still kind of districted in favor of Democrats the way it fell. I don't know. We can discuss that. But Loren, I'm going to let you jump in here. You've got a lot of expertise in this subject. I'm going to let you kind of start where you'd like.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. I've worked in probably 15 or 16 different states this year. Working in redistricting, either usually on the litigation side, on the plaintiff side. Many of it is involved with the Voting Rights Act challenges, typically involving a substantial minority population, whether Black, Latino, Native American, or Asian Pacific Islander. And so there's a couple aspects to that I've encountered that is relevant to the introduction, which is take Texas, for example. What we're observing in places like Texas and Florida, and part of what I'm talking about too relates to a lot of my research, which is on Latino politics and immigration. I wrote a whole book on sanctuary cities and stuff like that. So, I tend to follow demographic change, and so what you've observed in Texas and Florida in particular are large, 2 million type population growth. The vast majority of that are coming from either Asian or more Latino growth, population growth. And yet those communities, Latino voters in general, have not seen an increase in their seats. And so the Republican legislature in Texas and the governor effectively drew a map that essentially maintained Republican control, as you talked about.
Right.
And part way they did that was basically cracking different communities of color in and around Houston, in and around Dallas areas in particular.
In Florida, it's particularly draconian. It was going to be bad enough, and then the governor broke in with even a more draconian one, breaking up a famous black district up in the north that had been set up. Yeah.
So the term for that is called retrogression, which and retrogression is a process that occurs when there had previously been a seat effectively that would elect, say, black candidates or black voters preferred candidate. It doesn't necessarily have to be a black candidate, but it typically would be. We're talking districts that are 35, 45 to 50% plus black, and they're basically a district that will guarantee the election of, say, a black candidate and representative. And so DeSantis kind of broke that up. But one really interesting aspect of Florida, because I was working on draft maps in Florida, say around January, February, when you think about the Latino growth in that area, it's pretty diverse population. And so you have a large Cuban Hispanic area in South Florida, like in Miami, where you have some of the most packed districts in the entire country. But yet the Cuban population is fairly Republican. And so it's pretty complicated in Florida of how you put together, say, a community of interest of Latinos, say, from Central America and Mexico. And do you put who may be more democratic in their voting behavior? And do you put them with the Cuban Latino population or not? And that was a very hard thing to determine, and it kind of, really gets at the kind of limits of ethnicity, specifically on the Latino front.
Yeah, that is complicated because the Cuban population, as we know, is one of the few non-white populations that tends to be Republican, less so than in past generations, but still leaning Republican, as opposed to Puerto Rican or Mexican origin.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the aspects you always look for in potentially bringing some sort of Section 2 voting rights claim is the districts were drawn in a way that packed minorities like 80% plus, right? So when you do that, you have the effect of potentially diluting the minority population's vote, because you might be able to split it, 50-50 and get two districts for the price of one, as it were. But in the case of South Florida, the Cuban population is so dense in places like Hialeah and Miami Gardens and stuff like that, that you can almost not avoid packing that population there.
Sure.
And so it was a really interesting challenge that I kind of faced there that I had never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a little bit different. And I mentioned Alabama and New Orleans because in order for the Republicans to do this in Alabama, they had to create like an octopus-shaped thing to basically bag in so that out of the 7 districts, you have 30% black population, but they're only a majority vote in one of the 7 districts. In Louisiana, they create a snake, between the 2 major cities to be able to keep a similar proportion there. And so you have these odd looking districts doing that. And to be sure, even when the Voting Rights Act, before it was gutted, for whatever reason, Obama didn't challenge it in 2010. I don't know why, but they, this has gone on for years, but this is what happens in the South. This is the Deep South, but and we used to have when you used to come up with maps like this, it had to be at least monitored by the courts, but we don't have that monitoring anymore.
Well, a lot of the monitoring has, so the Shelby v. Holder decision, I think it was maybe 2013, and that was the decision that basically got rid of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And Section 5, just for your listeners, I have this bit of this, kind of professorial way of speaking, and that's just because I teach class, right? And so if I sound a little pedantic, please excuse that. But um, uh, I'm sure my mom always loves talking to me. But so what happened in that decision is previous, and I'm sure you know this, but previous to the Holder v. Shelby or Shelby v. Holder decision, any change to a districting scheme from pretty much most southern states or any state that basically any area that had been triggered under Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act that pretty much required that jurisdiction to run their maps by the
Right.
Department of Justice or the DC court, I think. And
Mhm.
so if they drew this crazy gerrymandered district that diluted the Black population's ability to elect more candidates of choice than it could based on its numbers, the DOJ would potentially check that. So that's no longer possible. And so that's one reason why you continue to see some of this, racial gerrymandering going on.
Right. In
But
2000,
there still is this Section 2 that we are still working in.
yeah,
But that's on the docket now of potentially being cracked into.
right. In 2013, the Supreme Court decided there's no racism in those states anymore, so we don't have to do that. So that's it really gutted it, and now we'll see what's left. You said you're involved in a bunch of lawsuits, but it looks like most of the lawsuits have been basically postponed until after this coming election. I mean, everything they're saying, oh, we just don't have time. We're just going to have to let this election happen. And so it looks like, they might, maybe they'll have merit, but it looks like for 2022, most of these maps are going to hold unless there's state government action. And it looks like those are done with too, for the most part.
Right. That's an interesting observation, and that generally rings true based on what I've seen and what I've been involved in. Some of the action too, though, that's important to keep in mind is at the local level. So I was just up in South Dakota yesterday testifying on behalf of a Native American tribe who's seeking representation in a small county. And that was a Voting Rights Act claim, Section 2 claim, which is a vote dilution claim. Happy to get into the details of that a little bit since it's public record. But in Georgia, I was involved in basically the state redistricting case there. And what was so interesting about that, so under the Section 2, what we're required as at least political science experts, someone has to be able to draw a map that shows that you can achieve, say, another district that is, say, majority Black or majority minority. If you're putting two minority groups together, you need to show that they tend to vote the same way. And that's done through a bunch of different statistical methods. And then you have to show what's known as racially polarized voting. So in the South, it's generally going to be Black voters vote this way, white voters vote this way. And then you have to show that usually the Black preferred candidate is losing. So the expert who was doing that showed that and demonstrated that very clearly. And so that would still be basically a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as interpreted through case law. And the judge even admitted that. The judge acknowledged that basically we had made our case and then decided to not do anything anyways because we pretty much have to wait until the Alabama case that went to the Supreme Court that got then kicked back down. We basically have to wait until that a full decision after the next round of elections are done. So after 2022, so that case the Alabama case will get litigated in 2023. We'll see what happens. If there's an opening, then there'll be more litigation on these districts, probably in places like Louisiana, places like South Carolina, places like Georgia. And so the old ruling basically that would have determined that a state or a jurisdiction had drawn an unlawful map in accordance with the VRA is on hold, basically.
Well, yeah, let me ask you about that. I mean, obviously, so these are going to go forward. Were you involved in any of the Ohio litigation?
No, I wasn't. That was I typically come in on so one of my main research areas is kind of racial politics and historically, but also just kind of voting, like, do people hold racial attitudes about certain groups, stereotypes, et cetera? and then how does that drive them to vote? How do different groups of voters vote? That kind of stuff. And so the Ohio litigation was, I think it was a partisan claim, and same thing I think with North Carolina. And so, but I was in another case. I was involved in the Kansas redistricting case, and there some of the same experts, some of the experts that I wasn't working with them, but they do one thing, I do another, and they were involved in both of Ohio and North Carolina. And what they do basically is in order to show basically a partisan gerrymander, basically you'll create a map, right? So what happens is that somebody draws a map, and they do it in a way that says, Republicans are going to win 70% of the seats, even though based on, say, the presidential vote, they should win 50% of the seats, right?
Right.
And so what we do as political scientists is we'll take a bunch of voting data at the precinct level, and we'll take GIS, Geographic Information Systems software, and very statistical techniques, and we'll simulate thousands of maps of hypothetical maps. And what we'll do to see if there's a partisan gerrymander is we'll show that if you simulated this, randomly sort of drew 10,000 maps, you would maybe get an average of 50% of the districts are going to be won by Republicans, 50% could be won by Democrats. And then they say, look at this map that you ended up with. It's way so far, into statistical standard deviation, multiple standard deviation territory, that this is a total outlier. And so that's what these guys were doing. And I think they were successful in that. And so that the maps had to then be redrawn to be more balanced.
Yeah, he didn't have to do that with Ohio. It was so obvious. It was blatant, but it was.
Yeah. But you have to in court, though. I mean, you have to in court because the threshold is so high.
Right. What happened in Ohio, and it looks like they had to overdo it, was that the actual Republican judge voted with the Democratic judges and have overturned it. I don't know what happened last, but I think the Republicans ran out of the clock, kept doing the same map over and over again. But but it was fascinating, the dynamics there, because that's one of the places that they really gerrymandered. They were trying to take a woman
last time.
Yeah, the last time too. It'll be interesting to see, but they're having a hard time gerrymandering too. For instance, in Georgia, because the Atlanta metropolitan district just keeps growing. There's only so many ways they can.
That's right.
Gerrymandered. In Utah, they are having a hard time because all they can do is send tendrils into Salt Lake City, which is growing, right? You've got the four districts, and sooner or later that's going to be too hard. Sooner or later they're going to be stuck with a Democratic. They have in the past had a Democratic one, but it looks ridiculous. They've got to break up the city into four, tendrils, or at least three going in there. I mean, it just is absolutely ridiculous how they do this. And unless you've got a state that basically says you got to be fair, it doesn't happen. And there just isn't a partisan interest in doing that unless you've got a racial basis, to do it. And anyway, it's so that's why the Voting Rights Act is so important. But with this Supreme Court, I just don't know where it's going to go. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back, and I'll have you address the importance of the Voting Rights Act and whether or not there's any future for it.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Loren, what do you think? Is there a future for the Voting Rights Act? I mean, we've got a Supreme Court that just seems to be ready to shut everything down. Every progressive advance that we've made over the past 50 years, the majority already pretty much, as you said, shut down Section 5. Is Section 2 next?
Yeah. If I had to guess, I think that the Section 2, which is kind of the last protection that minority populations have in terms of influence, collective influence, and ensuring that voters in different groups have an equitable chance of being able to elect candidates that they want, it doesn't look so good. I can't make a full-on prediction, but my hope would be that the Roberts Court kind of minimizes it as opposed to just completely throwing it out. And so what I mean by that is they'll set the burden of proof at a higher level than what it has been previously. And there's lots of different ways that can go. But one would be kind of the methodological approach that an expert like myself has to take is more challenging. If we're talking about, I'll just give you an example. If we're talking about a coalition claim. So with the rise of Latino and Asian populations in places like California, Texas, someone could theoretically bring a Section 2 voting rights claim that says, okay, these groups tend to vote together, and so we can combine them, and so therefore we can meet the threshold of a majority-minority seat. That's very hard to prove in certain cases, given data availability. But those types of things could be the types of things that the court kind of says, okay, we still got it a little bit, but there you go. But based on kind of my layperson's perspective, I would think that observing what the court has done already, given how conservative it is, it does seem like it's hanging on by a thread.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what Congress can do because, you can pass another Voting Rights Act, but they'll just call it a federal overreach. I mean, it's they really have to start looking into, possible term limits for Supreme Court justices or something.
So what Congress has sort of pushed to try to do like a federal Voting Rights Act, but given kind of the stalling between Manchin and Sinema in the Senate, that didn't really go anywhere. And so what I've kind of pushed for, and I wrote an article in the Washington Post about this in January, was so effectively what the kind of conservative Republican states have done really well over the last, say, 20 years or so, and coordinated through various interest groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, is they've enacted a lot of state level legislation and also spent money pushing for local state level kind of dominance. And so that's why they've been able to draw districts and control redistricting every 10 years. It doesn't seem like there's an equivalent on the left, but one good bill that recently was enacted is the New York Voting Rights Act. And so California has one, the California Voting Rights Act. I think Oregon has one. Washington State has one. And so what I think that's going to happen is different kind of Democratic leaning states are going to start to say, okay, we've got to take matters into our own hands. But it does seem without that federal protection, a lot of communities of color in the South in particular are going to have less influence than their numbers suggest that they should.
As they have been.
That's why you need federal legislation or federal protections, right? Given the history of the United States.
Yeah, no, definitely. So where do you think you've been looking at it? And I, like I said, I was kind of surprised that it wasn't leading to more Republicans. And then I started to look at it, and it's like, because they already did it. You can't get any more out of Alabama. You got the black voters have to vote somewhere, right? So do you think that Republicans outside of places like Florida and maybe Ohio picked up many votes this time around, many districts?
Most of the lawyers and people I know who really follow this. So part of my issue is I know a whole lot about a few very specific areas that I've actually worked. And normally I don't have as much of a broader perspective because I have friends who worked in Maryland and stuff like that, but I didn't do that. And so I just don't know the details as much, but they work in a lot of the lawyers that I work with, they work all over the US. And it does seem that their perspective is the Democrats have done much better than kind of people thought they would. I think your kind of mechanism as to why that's the case really makes a lot of sense. But still, that's maybe not the appropriate way to look at it. In a country that's kind of diversifying demographically, and the groups that are kind of leading that change disproportionately tend to vote Democrat. Yeah. And so if there was no gerrymandering or kind of preferencing going on, taking into account the fact that certain people live in certain areas and like urban areas are more Democrat, kind of smaller areas other than Humboldt are more Republican, that, that kind of housing balance of where people residentially live tends to somehow benefit Republican kind of conservative voters in the geography of redistricting. But putting that to aside, you would think overall that the Democratic Party would just kind of gain seats given this demographic change. And so I think people are looking at the wrong baseline. They're looking at the baseline that is like, oh, it's not necessarily worse than it was, but really the baseline should be actually what should it be based on these kind of changing numbers?
Yeah, there's no way. I mean, that Republicans should have more districts than the Democrats. There's no way. The numbers aren't there, and the demographics aren't there. No, the fact that it exists that way, is the gerrymandering that began under Thomas DeLay in 2000. I mean, there's always been gerrymandering, but he made an art of it. Started it in Texas, the hammer, and it just got to ridiculous proportions, especially by 2010.
It's gotten a lot easier because of the technology is more readily available. I mean, it used to be probably in the 90s, people would have printout walkout maps and stuff like that. I don't actually know, but for the most part, there's software that we all use, or that's even publicly available. And so on the other hand, and so that's made it very easy to go block by block or precinct by precinct, look at the demographics and see if you can, get your numbers over. And that's kind of why you wind up with these crazy districts sometimes. But on the other hand, it's kind of democratized redistricting in places like Washington or California, where there's a commission. They had a ton of participation from local people all over kind of local areas. And so I think I observed the California process somewhat, and I was involved in some redistricting activity down in the Inland Empire because I used to be a professor at UC Riverside. So I still kind of do some work down there. And I was pleasantly surprised by how seriously they thought about other people's proposals. They considered all the kind of classical redistricting criteria, particularly communities of interest, trying to keep like-minded communities together. And I don't think California has been sued. To my knowledge, there's no major California lawsuit. Even though some of the districts look a little funky, that's often going to happen by just virtue of how you kind of have to stick to certain criteria. Overall, I think because it's evident that they haven't been sued, and so what would you sue on? You would have to sue on some sort of partisan gerrymander or some sort of racial gerrymander, and so I think they did a really good job. And
it's not protecting incumbents either. I mean, a couple of them are having
not at all. Yeah.
Leave. Yeah, it's it's fascinating too, because, and I actually think one of my predictions is that partly because of the way we are doing our votes now, the universal mail-in ballots, it allows for organizing. It's hard to get people to the ballots. A lot of people, you got to go pick up the kids. You're working all day and the rest. But if you can organize people to call and say, hey, you've got a ballot sitting on your table on your front door with your mail, it's easier to get them to to open it up and put it into the mail. They did it with the recall election. All the polls were confounded by it. There were people, they had it much closer. They were like 10 points, 15 points off because the Democratic Party was able to turn their votes out I'm actually anticipating possibly that there are going to be 3 or 4 seats flipped towards the Democrats, even though this is a bad year for the Democrats because of that organizing principle. And it you know in the South down in that area, and I've got there's a whole lot to go, but it was done fairly, and just because it was done fairly, it will benefit Democrats in the South. I don't think there's going to be much change in the northern part of the
certainly not in Humboldt and all that. I mean, I'm just looking at the Humboldt. It was at District 2, is it now? It looks pretty good to me. I mean, if I were going to draw a map, that's basically what I mean. When you kind of think of the 101 and corridor and stuff like that, you got Siskiyou too there going over into the other district that's more conservative. I mean, maybe parts of Trinity would be better somewhere else, but in general, it looks like if I had to draw one, that's pretty much what I might do.
They were talking about cutting us off from the south and merging us with Shasta County and the rest, but there was a big outcry. It just wasn't a community of interest. We definitely identify as the 707 district.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that speaks to the central role. And I think this is why, I grew up in California, spent most of my life there, and obviously I love California. Who doesn't? But there were times I remember growing up where it didn't seem like the state government worked at all. There were all these issues. At least that was kind of what you would hear in the news. But I do feel like they're doing democracy quite well now. And I've been involved in some projects where we're really focusing on, okay, how do we give people the greatest opportunity to vote? And that's pretty, from an elections administration standpoint, whether it's drop boxes or vote by mail and all these other things. So it's really good to see that.
Yeah, no, no, it's a model, and of course that's why certain people don't want it. I mean, and of course they're going to say, oh, there's massive fraud and the rest, but there isn't. I mean, they set up a commission to show it, but that's a whole other discussion. I mean, it's just we do have a really good model for it here, and when people vote, things happen. But it's
we take a lot of our cues in New Mexico from California. I mean, at least that's what it seems in terms of some of the steps that the state is taking to try to, boost political participation and ensure that we have, a strong democracy. So it's true on a lot of things. California sets the model, and then a lot of other states follow.
Real quickly, we only have about a minute left, but New Mexico, there's an interesting lawsuit. Republicans are actually suing because the districts were made more competitive. It's, bizarre.
You have the District 2 there, at least the congressional one, that was a little more Republican before, I think. So,
and they're suing because it was partisan. But I think it's gonna be hard pressed to say you made all 4 districts more competitive, and so that's somehow biased. I don't know. Anyway, granted there were political reasons for doing it. Same thing happened in Nevada. They're all more competitive. Democrats are taking a real chance there. We'll see if it pays off. But
that's right.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a big topic, and I'm glad this is a real important issue that you're working on. And I've got your website. What is your website so that people can know to go to it? It's very interesting.
It's collingwoodresearch.com, just my surname.
I encourage people to go to it. This is really important because this is going to be one of the major fights in the future. We're going to have to find a way to get around the Supreme Court, but it's going to be really important.
Well, but let me ask it the other way then. If you're a corporation that has eaten up most of the competition and cornered the market, is it easier for you to raise prices on your customers and maximize your profits because you don't have to worry about losing your business? In other words, you've lost the discipline that the market imposes.
In principle, if you don't have competition and you're a monopolist, yes, you can raise your prices.
Okay, and over the past year, we know that prices have risen because of supply chain problems, unexpected shifts in the demand for goods, and even higher labor costs. But if corporations were simply passing along these costs in highly competitive markets, would the company's profit margins have changed much?
So many things affect those that calculation. in principle, you could be right, but
well, it's very much not what we're seeing.
All right, so for this segment, we're going to discuss the Senate. And we've been discussing this in the past few shows, and I just want to point out that 538 has kind of reversed its Senate forecast. If you go to their page at the top of their right-hand column, they have their projections, and the last time I reported on this, they had projected that the Democrats had a 46 in 100 chance of holding on to the Senate. They are now projected at having a 52 in 100 chance. Now, we're still a long ways from November. A lot can happen now and then, but and this is not strictly based on polls. They look at a lot of different data. They look at how campaigns are going. They look at economic considerations and a lot of different things. I don't know how the economy fits into that, but one of the things that I've been marveling at is the fact that they in some of this polling data, they look at the Biden approval rating, which is down everywhere, largely because of inflation. No matter how well he's doing, whether you consider the Ukraine war or anything else, they blame inflation on the president. Whether or not he deserves it is a whole other question. but when inflation is up, the president takes the heat, and his ratings have been down in the 30s, some polls in the low 40s, but they're low. But in the same polling set, the Democratic candidates have done really well. Now, some of it might have to do with the particular dynamics of a particular race, where you have a really good, charismatic Democratic Party candidate and maybe a really bad Republican candidate, and I'm going to suggest that that's probably the case in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman, as we've discussed, is very charismatic, working class appeal, steel working steel town mayor kind of a guy. Dr. Oz is a celebrity, rich guy, handpicked by Trump, who isn't all that popular in Pennsylvania these days. And isn't campaigning very effectively in Pennsylvania. So you could say maybe that is the particular things. But you look all across the Midwest and you look in other places, and it just doesn't seem like the Democrats are being affected, at least in the Senate. Maybe other places like the House, it seems like are being affected in those polls. But for whatever reason, the polling data, Biden is not, as the pundits are expecting, dragging down his candidates, and for whatever reason, the pundits do not want to leave that narrative. Well, the party is going to be dragged down. It's the first election after the presidential election. Historically, it almost always happens that they're supposed to lose seats, but it may not happen with the Senate this time around. And the Senate is the more conservative. I don't even think we should have a Senate this way. It's kind of the more reactionary, but this might be where the Democrats actually get saved this time around. But I want to talk little bit about that. But Loren, you want to talk a little bit about the discrepancy between the polling data for Biden and the polling data for the Democratic candidates?
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I think the reason why it's an interesting discussion, at least by pundits and in the media, is that it is true. Political science research tends to it's almost like a rule that the out party gains in the midterms. I think since I've been working in politics or following it or being a political scientist since, 2002 or so, I think it was really only 2002 when the incumbent party won. And that was because of 9/11, right? If you recall that, there was this kind of rally around the flag effect that W. Bush got. And so then when Obama was running in the 2010 midterms, if you might recall, his name really got slacking and run through the mud. And there were lots of news articles about how so-and-so is running for Senate, but that they're going to try to, distance themselves from that candidate. So that's like kind of a classic narrative that you hear in the media at this time in this cycle. And we're not, according to these numbers, really seeing that. And One reason I think might be the case, and just someone who maybe reads the New York Times and the Washington Post and some local stuff, stays up with the news, but maybe he doesn't live in Washington, D.C. anymore. So I don't have all the, the roll call and all this. I would think that Biden is not very front and center in the news. When you think about it, he's there, but he's not like Obama and Trump. At least that's what it seems like to me. And so therefore, maybe the connection that's getting drawn between him and inflation and the kind of local Democratic candidates that are running is not as observable. And so instead, these races are turning more on kind of localized personality context, which is there's a famous book by this guy, Richard Fenno, who was a old school professor at University of Rochester. And he developed this, he would follow these campaigns around and basically realize that there's this kind of home appeal, right? That candidates in local areas kind of craft this home style. And so Mark Kelly walks around with like maybe a bolo tie. He's the senator from Arizona, or maybe kind of a little bit of a cowboy hat looking thing, kind of that you wouldn't really see in parts of California potentially, or Washington State, even though maybe he might have the same kind of political voting behavior as some of those candidates. And so in places like there, Nevada, and Fetterman is a great example where he himself does not exhibit some sort of classic elite figure. And so we're rather kind of more blue collar, and Pennsylvania does have a history of kind of electing these moderate type Democrats or Republicans. If you recall, I forget, the last person I think who switched from Republican to Democrat was the Pennsylvania senator, forget his name, but
Arlen
without
Specter.
actually,
Arlen
Arlen
Specter.
Specter, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And so it seems to me that you put those two things in combination. One, Biden is not as front and center in the news; he's a little bit more low profile, which actually, honestly, is a nice break after the Trump years. And number two, the elections appear at this moment to be kind of hinging a little bit more on the localized characteristics of the candidates, which is how I think democracy should work. That is a good thing when you don't have the presidential race completely, lining up behind everybody. And maybe it's the kind of thing where it's like you can blame inflation on the president, but you can't necessarily blame inflation on a senator or something like that, right? But it's hard to know exactly without looking at it more in depth.
I also wonder if there's a Trump factor, because a lot of these candidates the Democrats are running against Trump endorsed candidates. In Warnock up against Herschel Walker, who's just a disaster for the Republicans so far.
Absolutely.
Up there. Oz being, the celebrity that Trump takes. Vance, the same thing. Now the pundits are all saying, oh no, there's no way that that Vance is going to lose that. Tim Ryan, it's a deep beat red state, but Sherrod Brown is more liberal than Tim Ryan, and Ryan actually, you would think would have a better chance. He's got that same working class appeal, and he's been ahead in the polls so far. So why are they writing him off? And Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is the incumbent, but they're not giving Mandela Barnes any chance. But it looks, in the past week, two of the candidates, Democratic candidates, have pulled out of the race to back Mandela Barnes, because he's a good candidate. He's won statewide. He's the lieutenant governor.
Yeah, he's a great
he's
candidate. I think we're still a little early in the cycle. I think the number of polls are going to start increasing now. People are only finally starting to pay attention. Kind of Labor Day is coming up, and this.
But
it's
none
always
of the
sad for
pundits
me
are
when
even
Labor Day comes
considering the possibility that Barnes can win. And I'm just like, at least consider it. He's ahead in the polls, and they just don't even consider it a possibility. And maybe that's to Barnes' advantage, but it's just they don't see it coming. But it boggles the mind. And I think there's a Midwest phenomenon here, because that's where Biden really made the difference. That was a switch of something like 12% of the working class white vote had a shift from Trump to Biden. In that, and maybe there's a union effect. Maybe there is a between 2016 and 2020. maybe there's something there that's just being missed. I don't know.
The Midwest is a perennial battleground. I mean, Wisconsin, Michigan, sometimes Minnesota, Iowa used to be. Ohio has kind of shifted a little less so, and Pennsylvania. Those are in a lot of ways where the elections are always very competitive because you have different types of constituencies. You have kind of the old school blue dog working class Democrat that might be more socially conservative. Then you have kind of a fairly decent sized black population in a lot of these areas, and Macomb County type middle class white population. Anyway, so these people often, in aggregate, some of the populations here are kind of socially conservative, but are not exactly loaded. And so they struggle. And so that's why a candidate like a Fetterman can keep that in place, say, for the Democrats in certain cases like that. And that's really critical in the off-year cycle, not the presidential cycle, because you tend to have a drop-off in certain voting demographics that would normally vote for Democrats, but they're less likely to vote. And so, a Fetterman-type candidate can be pretty critical to winning a place like Pennsylvania in 2018, we're 2022. Look at that.
Yeah, and as Matt just pointed out, 1998 was a midterm election. I don't know how much the rule applies to the second midterm and in the second term, but and Clinton actually, the Democrats actually prevailed on that. I think they gained a seat, but there are always exceptions.
94 was the blowout.
That was the blowout. That was horrible for the Democrats. That was the contract on America whole thing. But I think the problem is pundits, they get into rules and they treat them like laws of physics, like there's no exceptions. And so they have it and they still keep talking about like Mark Kelly is in danger. I don't see any evidence that Mark Kelly is in danger. He's been well ahead in all of the polls, and his opposition just seems pathetic. I'm sorry. And he is solid. He's an astronaut, popular. His wife is popular. I don't see any reason to believe he's in danger. I mean, I don't think he's going to be a blowout, but I just don't see any reason, unless he does something to mess up, to believe he's in any danger. I don't consider that a battleground state for the Senate right now. I don't know. What do you think?
It's usually you kind of look at the last presidential election and you see which states were within a couple points, and that's your kind of fundamental baseline, with the assumption that a decent candidate will kind of hit somewhere around that, or you might add or drop a couple points depending on turnout issues, right? Because that's always a major feature in off years or midterm elections, the lower turnout. But overall, I would agree with you, Kelly, in terms of he's a little bit on the Democratic conservative side, but that might help him a little bit in certain areas. For example, he's more conservative on immigration, for example, than a lot of, say, the California representatives would be. But politically, that might benefit him. And then you're right, he has this great kind of record as an astronaut and everything. And Arizona has been trending more Democratic, largely due to the Latino growth, and also, Phoenix has a lot of people from California moving out to Phoenix and stuff like that, and so it's been changing. So I would agree that it's not as much of a swing state, but it is. If it was close last time, of course, there's going to be lots of money spent there. There's going to be lots of ads there and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a stretch. I would say that Nevada is about the biggest worry for the Democrats right now, and but even
that's
she's
very
ahead.
close.
Yeah, but she's even ahead in the polls. But it's early to really rely on the polls. But I think that would be a tough one. I think the Republicans were hoping for New Hampshire, but once Sununu pulled out, I think that was pretty much the end.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of when you look at if you go to the various websites that talk about, that place contests into different columns, and you go to the toss-up, it doesn't look that good for the Democratic Party. But then when you do a more qualitative study of the different elections that are, quote, competitive, you can see the Democrats potentially running the table. It seems hard to imagine the Republicans running the table on those same contests. Now, they only have to win a couple. It's sort of like when Trump won. He had to run the table in all these states, and everyone's like, no way, that's not going to happen. But he did.
We'll be discussing the Senate on into the election, but that completes the segment. All right, this brings us to the point of the show where we have predictions. Loren, you got a prediction for us?
Well, this is a Texas race that I've been watching very closely, District 28. That is Henry Cuellar's seat. I'm going to predict that he prevails, but that if he eventually gets ousted in a primary, that you will get a Republican Latino that will emerge and will win that seat. That could be 4 years down the line.
All right, I'm going to go to Wisconsin. I'm not going to predict a Barnes win. That would be ridiculous in November. I am going to predict, though, that Barnes is going to win big in the primary, and I'm going to predict that within 2 weeks, the pundits are going to be forced to take his campaign seriously, because I believe that the polls are still going to be close enough, and that the campaign is going to take on enough energy, because Ron Johnson has made some big mistakes. First of all, he bought into the big lie, head first. And Wisconsin is not Oklahoma. Wisconsin is a purple state that maybe leans a bit, blue. So I think that is going to be a key battleground race for the Senate, and I think that the pundits are going to start acknowledging that by mid-August. That's my prediction. So
it's a good prediction. I love it.
Thanks. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Loren. Maybe we'll get to have you back sometime. I really appreciate it, and I love your insights. But
Great.
Until next, we'll have Dave back next time. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.